Thank you and welcome. I'm Scott Showalter, president of the Oregon Symphony. Welcome to a special program called Musical Reflections of Oregon's Ecosystem. I thank those joining from the World Forestry Center in Portland, Oregon, and those of you watching online via our live Facebook stream. Our live audience last year hailed from all countries, well, no, not all countries, all states in the U.S. That'd be something, right? But in fact, over 200 countries, so I want to thank all of our viewers wherever you are. I thank the World Forestry Center for hosting us this evening, and thanks especially to our partners, the Audubon Society of Portland and Friends of the Columbia Gorge. Throughout the year, the Oregon Symphony produces 110 concerts on stage at the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall downtown Portland, and hundreds more engagement programs like this around our region. This season, we bring you Sounds of Home, a special three-part series in which we offer a unique, nonpartisan opportunity for our audiences to reflect on three timely topics: immigration, or search for home, the environment, or collective home, and homelessness, or the need for a home. Sounds of Home is made possible by a community of institutional and individual supporters. We thank them for their generosity. In November, our first Sounds of Home program focused on immigration. In addition to a themed concert at the Schnitz, we collaborated with arts and social service organizations to produce American Voices, which celebrated the deep and varied influences of immigration on art. This May, as we focus on our third topic of homelessness, we bring the Lullaby Project to Portland. This initiative, out of Carnegie Hall, pairs pregnant women and new mothers in the homeless community in Portland with professional songwriters to compose and record lullabies for their children. Through additional Sounds of Home outreach, we visit shelters and daycare centers, immigration and refugee organizations, and healthcare and service providers. Tonight, our Sounds of Home focus is the environment. Our 90-minute program, you'll hear speakers from the Audubon Society of Portland and Friends of the Columbia Gorge, and be entertained by a quintet of Oregon Symphony musicians. Their selections were inspired by our natural environment. At the center of our program are 4 interludes by local composers. Each enjoys its world premiere tonight. The symphony commissioned each of these composers to select a bird native to Oregon and write a piece of music inspired by its song. Listen closely, as each piece will begin with a recording of that bird song that inspired its composer. These birdsong clips were provided by the sound archivists at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We thank them. The pieces are accompanied by photography provided by members of the Audubon Society of Portland and Friends of the Columbia Gorge. I know several of you are also in the room, and I thank you. And I finally thank the musicians and composers here tonight. You will find further background for those of you in your room in our printed program, and those online can click the link next to your live Facebook video. I ask you now, as we begin, to please silence electronic devices and help me welcome to the stage our quintet of principal woodwind musicians.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Karen Miller Packwood. I play in the Oregon Symphony. I've been with the symphony for about 10 years. I'm excited to share this evening of music inspired by the natural world with you, as well as hear from our partners at the Audubon Society and Friends of the Gorge. With the increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters hitting closer to home, I found myself strongly motivated to try and make a difference in the fight against climate change. In filling out a volunteer questionnaire on the 350.org website last spring, I realized that the options listed were not my strength. My strength lies in music. It was then that I knew I needed to host a concert to raise awareness in our community and inspire others to get involved and contribute in their own way. With the encouragement of my husband, Matthew, as well as my friend and colleague, James, I approached the Oregon Symphony about incorporating my idea with the Sounds of Home series and producing a woodwind concert at the World Forestry Center. Many weeks later, through considerable effort of many talents people working hard and being generous with their time and talents, here we are. This concert would not be possible without the generosity of my brilliant symphony colleagues, Martha Long, Marty Hebert, James Shields, and John Cox. As well as the 4 composers involved in this project: Evan Kuhlmann, Robert Keir, David Schiff, and my husband, Matthew Packwood. I also want to recognize the long hours of support from volunteer Ken Wells and the dedicated office of the Oregon Symphony, Scott Showalter, Steve Wenig, Jacob Blazer, and especially Monica Hayes, who worked tirelessly to bring this inspiration to fruition. To them, I am extremely grateful, as I am to all of you who share this passion for protecting the natural beauty around us. My hope is that we all leave today inspired and motivated to reflect on how we can use our own unique strengths to foster hope and generosity and to fight for the preservation of the planet. And with that, I would like to introduce Nick Hardigg of the Audubon Society of Portland.
Thank you very much, Karen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nick Hardigg, Executive Director of the Audubon Society of Portland. At Portland Audubon, we've been connecting people with nature through the love of birds and wildlife since 1902. And through that magical and enduring connection, we've been effective advocates for the very qualities that we feel make Portland and Oregon our uniquely special home. Back in 1902, I think it's unlikely that many in the Audubon community recognized that a small group of thoughtful, committed birders could change our Oregon world. But I think we have. In our first year, we passed one of Oregon's original conservation laws, the Oregon Model Bird Act, and we then lobbied President Theodore Roosevelt for creation of the first national wildlife refuges in the West, at Klamath Lake, Three Arch Rocks, and of course Malheur, which we've defended ever since. A little more about our history. In the 1930s, we opened the nation's first and now oldest wildlife rehabilitation center. In the 1960s, we helped create 3 more national wildlife refuges in Oregon's Willamette Valley. In the 90s, we pioneered the concept of nature in the city, recognizing that there is valuable habitat in our own rooftops, parks, and backyards that are critical for the ongoing health of wildlife and our planet. And just last year, we helped pass the strongest funding legislation for youth environmental education in the United States with Outdoor School for All. So, our work and the work of our partners goes on, inspired by birds and by nature. But tonight at this musical event, honoring the environment, I'd like to wonder aloud if it might be birds' musical ability itself that make them so captivating for so many of us. And if it is music that captivates so many birders to be conservationists, then could we make a connection that perhaps it's music that is responsible for the entire conservation movement? I mean, clearly there is something very special about music and about birds and about wildlife that make our home and our lives special. The late and very beloved Ursula K. Le Guin, author, poet, activist, and longtime supporter of our work at Malheur Refuge, gave the world many thoughtful works, including this poem about birdsong. This is called Learning the Name. The wood thrush, it is, now I know, who sings that clear arpeggio, 3 far notes weaving into the evening among leaves and shadow. Or at dawn in the woods, I've heard the sweet ascending triple word echoing over the silent river, but never seen the bird. Thank you, Ursula. Our composers tonight have interpreted several bird songs in their works. Among them, I've been told, is represented the marbled murrelet, a small, plump seabird related to the puffin that feeds at sea and nests far inland in old-growth forests. In 1986, we investigated its decline and petitioned the EPA for its protection. In 1992, it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And since then, its numbers, unfortunately, have continued to decline. And we fought to stop further destruction of its habitat at places like the Elliott State Forest. Currently, some estimates place the likelihood that the marbled murrelet will be extinct in Oregon by 80%, an 80% chance of that by 2060 if conditions don't improve. This Friday, there is a public hearing in Portland regarding uplisting this bird's protection level to endangered status, requiring a recovery plan for its habitat. And you can learn more on our website. Unfortunately, the marbled murrelet's challenges are not unique among seabirds. For seabirds that have been monitored, global populations are down 70%, 70%, since 1950. And so tonight's appreciation of birds through music is not only appreciated, but it's also necessary as a rallying call for their protection among a broader musical audience. And that's why the Oregon Symphony's Sounds of Home series is so highly relevant from a conservationist point of view. If we're to protect nature for future generations, then we need to reach and find relevance among many communities, not only among our members. We need to see and hear beyond our own focus areas, beyond birds, beyond nature, beyond classical music, and consider what home truly means for those with whom we don't regularly connect. These are challenging times. They're times of climate change and forest fires, of immigrants and dreamers, of homelessness and dreams denied. And if we don't try to see the challenges of those beyond our own bubbles, then we won't ever understand how we can invite them in. And so I say thank you to Karen and Scott and Monica and Ken and the entire Oregon Symphony. Thank you to its composers, supporters, and musicians for your efforts to broaden our perspective on what the sounds of home really means, not only to us, but to everyone. It is now my pleasure to direct your attention, if you please, back to the Oregon Symphony Woodwind Quintet for a performance of 4 original compositions based on Oregon birdsong. Thank you.
I'm Robert Keir, and I'm the composer of the next work that is entitled Birds of a Feather. And when I was commissioned to create this work, I was thrilled to receive in my email inbox an archive of 20 bird songs from the Audubon Society. And I listened to them closely, and I chose 12 of them with the idea, because I couldn't just choose any one over any other, in order to create a tapestry of bird songs, which you'll hear now. It's a little musical drama. It will start with a collage of bird songs that I created by electronically putting the birds, several birds together, and that will start the piece, and then out of that will emerge the woodwind quintet. The clarinet is a birder, a human birder, and the other woodwinds are in fact birds who respond to the calls of the human birder who's going throughout Oregon, calling to birds to try to encourage them to respond. And we start in the forests, birds of the forest, then birds of water, then birds of the fields, and then as those birds are celebrating their songs, what should happen? But from high above, the raptors come. Peregrine falcons dive down, and the birds scatter. And then there's a silence, and then you'll hear the birds returning, birds of the forests and fields, celebrating the day and the approaching twilight. About 3 decades ago, a student of mine turned to me and said, out of the blue, by the way, the world would be a sad place without birds. And I've never forgotten that. When you think about it, birdsong is something that's always with us in Oregon. From the time we wake up in the morning till the time we go to bed at night, you're hearing birds continually. And they're such an amazing part of our lives that I hope all of the music we've composed today and everything that Nick Hardigg was saying earlier will inspire all of us to keep these great birdsong singers alive and strong into the future, not only because their songs are so true and beautiful, but because they're such an important part of us.
Hello and thank you. My name is Kevin Gorman. I'm the Executive Director at Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And before I start, I was asked to make a program announcement. At this point in the program, it says Conversations on the Creative Process. That's going to come at the end of this instead. So for the next few minutes, you have me instead. You know, when it comes to celebrating Oregon's many ecosystems, there are none that are more varied, more beautiful, or more intertwined with the human experience than the Columbia Gorge. For nowhere else in the world do we have a mighty river that is gouging its way through a major mountain range. The result is an 85-mile canyon with 5 distinct ecological zones, from rainforest to high desert, with wildflowers and wildlife that exist nowhere else on the planet, and waterfalls scoured out of Ice Age floods that would leave Old Testament writers quaking with disbelief. Now, last September, this beloved ecosystem took a hit as a fire broke out at Eagle Creek. And 3 days into this fire, I was sitting at home watching a live stream video feed. And as I watched, it appeared that the entire Columbia Gorge was on fire. And for a brief moment, I thought about what would be the mission of our organization moving forward. It was hard for me to imagine that at that moment of uncertainty, that within a mere 12 hours, I would be feeling immense relief. And within a matter of days, I would feel profound hope. Relief came the next morning as we watched the firefighters throw everything they had into saving Multnomah Falls Lodge. And as dawn came and the smoke cleared, we saw the lodge had been saved. But we also saw something that we'd never expected: green vegetation. The forest had been burned, but it wasn't scorched. From that relief came hope, with more and more people standing up saying they wanted to do something. On day 2 of the fire, we shut down all fundraising operations and asked people to direct donations to Hood River Search and Rescue. This was the outfit that was pulling the 150 hikers out of Punchbowl Falls. Within a matter of days, we raised over $46,000. But hope kept coming. Over a period of weeks, thousands of people signed up to volunteer through Friends of the Columbia Gorge and our partner group, Trail Keepers of Oregon, for forest restoration and trail rebuilding. Our membership jumped by 40%, and we had over 120 businesses make donations for fire and forest recovery efforts. Now, as horrifying as those night scenes were, when the fire subsided, a different picture emerged. And we saw a forest that out of the 48,000 acres that was burned, only 15% of that acreage was considered severely burned. 55% had low or very low burn intensity. But it was a mixed bag. You can see Multnomah Falls here over on the right, and you can see green trees and brown trees. Other areas, like Oneonta Creek, got hit harder. This is just above the gorge, Oneonta Gorge site. A little further up is a place called Triple Falls, a wonderful hiking spot. Well, this is what Triple Falls looks like today. And it's going to be years before humans get back to that point. But while humans stay out, nature is going to move in, and it's going to move in fast. You see, a forest like this, a freshly burned forest, is one of the most bountiful when it comes to biodiversity, and will not only have bugs, but species like black-backed woodpeckers coming in and claiming these now open landscapes. And we're going to see a wonderful regeneration of this forest. But it is a forest that's been burned and not destroyed. And we also have trails that have been closed. And we have communities that are still struggling. So we are indeed in a new era for gorge land, gorge trails, and gorge communities. But this is an era that is not just about challenges, but also some wonderful possibilities. So I want to walk through some of those possibilities. First, with the land. In the coming weeks, months, and even over the next few years, Friends of the Columbia Gorge is going to do everything it can to unleash the volunteers who want to get out there to complete work parties in those burned areas to allow a natural forest recovery. What we are going to be focusing on is the greatest enemy that these forests have, which are the invasive weeds, to make sure they stay out and give this forest a fighting chance to become a healthy forest in the decades to come. We're also going to work on trails to build and rebuild where appropriate. And that includes the crowdfunding effort that's going on right now with Multnomah Falls Trail. We're supporting that. But we also need to think about places that have perhaps been loved to death, like Oneonta Gorge. This is a place that needs a break, not just from the forest, but from all of us. And so we are going to make sure that this gets recovered before people come back into it. We're also promoting building trails on the Washington side and in the East Gorge for sustainable long-term trail systems. And then there's the historic highway, our grand old highway that is now synonymous with congestion and mile-long traffic backups. Right now, this part of the highway is closed. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to pause, hit the reset button, and think about how this highway should be used over the next century. We have a great opportunity here, and we need to capitalize on it. And then finally, the communities. Gorge forest and gorge communities are intertwined, and we need to make sure that both of them are healthy and both of them thrive into the future. So this is a big challenge, weaving together gorge land, gorge trails, and gorge communities. And Friends of the Columbia Gorge is the only nonprofit that lives in all of those worlds. And in fact, you could say we've been waiting for a moment like this. It was 6 years ago that we launched a vision called Gorge Towns to Trails. This is an idea for a trail system that wraps around the Columbia Gorge and ties into the communities. It helps protect habitat, it helps create trails, but also it helps move congestion out of the waterfall areas, and it helps support communities far outside of certain recreation areas. So it's an idea that's time has come, particularly now that the fire has come. Last spring, we publicly launched Preserve the Wonder, a campaign to purchase 7 properties on the Washington side, 420 acres. It's a $5.5 million campaign, and we are 85% of the way there. This was an important campaign before the fire. It is critical now, after the fire, to preserve all the land we can and make some of these trail connections. Now, as I was listening to the beautiful symphony tonight, I started thinking that the message that they're delivering to you is not so different than the message that I have. You know, the music that they bring, particularly what they're going to go out with, are pieces that we love and are familiar, and they allow us to embrace in the warmth of the familiarity. But they also push us out of our comfort zone, and they help us see what is beautiful in areas that we haven't looked before. And that's my message to you. I'm asking you to start moving out of the comfort zone that you have with the Columbia Gorge. When you think of the Columbia Gorge and what is known and loved, likely many of those places are off limits for the next year or so. What I'm asking you to do is think about trying new trails, venturing into new communities, experience new things. As my friends on the Washington side would say, for God's sakes, cross the river for once. And take part in these restoration efforts, ascribing to the adage of planting trees in whose shade you may never rest. And perhaps most important, If you're not a member of Friends of the Columbia Gorge, consider becoming one. Because the Columbia Gorge, this dear, dear friend of ours, has given and given and given to all of us for generations. And now it needs our help. And now it's our turn to give back. So thank you. And I am going to invite the quartet back out. Spring is in the air. The wildflowers are starting to bloom. So we're going to listen to Stravinsky on the way out.
I'm not supposed to speak right now, so I'm in trouble. But I just want to leave you guys with an image to think about with Rite of Spring, because you might be thinking, why are we doing this? Forget the original story to the ballet. I don't know if any of you are familiar to that. I just want you to focus on the vitality and the energy in this music. I was thinking about imagining the new growth in the forest and everything that's going to change in the next year or two, 20 years. And there's a lot of music in this work that sounds like worms and little budding flowers and all sorts of stuff. And there's just so much energy. And so I just want you guys to think about the rite of spring, the rebirth that's going to come, that always comes. And we thank you all for coming today and hope you've enjoyed the event.
James, Karen, John, Marty, Martha, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for your performance. I want to invite our composers in the remaining minutes that we have to join me on stage. We can hear a little bit about what was behind their compositions. Please welcome again Evan, Matthew, David, and Robert. So, and we've been fortunate to have 300 people here in the room at the World Forestry Center in Portland, Oregon. We've also had 1,300 people viewing us online via Facebook web streams for each of our partners. And I invite you to view this program in its entirety later on Facebook and also at orsymphony.org, where you can learn more about Sounds of Home. So for each of you, I'd like to hear briefly what inspired you, obviously the bird songs, how you thought about nature, music, and we heard from Robert a little bit already. Let's start with you, Evan. How is it that you came to think about this challenge?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming, and what an honor and a privilege to do this. I had the good fortune to be in touch with Nick and his incredible staff at Audubon Society of Portland, and really listening to this fantastic roster of birdsong. I thought there's such a huge amount of material. One of the things that's tricky sometimes as a composer is just finding the first inkling of an idea that you might develop, and here it was. And I set to transcribing some of the bird songs. They're really musically complicated, but they suggest, I think within the Meadowlark calls, they suggest their own kind of harmony, and that was a strong starting point for me, was that there was already a little bit of harmonic and rhythmic framework in the bird call, and the rest of it was just sort of, I think, for me, imagining the remaining framework of the piece.
Robert? David?
It all starts with a email, like everything these days. I got an email from Karen asking me to write a piece for woodwind quintet or subset, and suggested I go to websites to hear some bird songs. So then it's a question of matching the instruments and the sounds I'm hearing, and coming up with a piece. And one of my best friends is a birder, and he goes to strange places all around the world pursuing birds. So I decided to make a little portrait of my friend, and I thought that in this activity of birding, which I don't do, but my friend does, it's all about you're waiting for an encounter, and you never know when it's going to happen or what it's going to be. And that's what I wanted to put in my piece. And then I thought a nice way of showing how far we have to go is to have two very low instruments seeking for the high. So that's why we had the bassoon and the bass clarinet. Thank you.
Matthew?
My piece comes from something of a more personal place. It's kind of been gestating for years in that Karen and I had our first child 4 years ago, and that core lullaby is something I sang to my son when he was in utero even. But the bird part of it actually is personal as well. I'm sure all of us in this room have been in the wild, hiking or walking and hearing these kind of marvelous, even just today in our own neighborhood near Reed College, I heard this bird that I think might have been a black-capped chickadee, I'm not sure, but it was a call that was quite creative. And what's interesting is that, yes, there's the recordings we have of bird calls, but there's the individual personalities that birds demonstrate. And the call that I put in the piece is an actual thrush call that Karen and I both heard. It was the most melodic and sort of inventive call, and I've never been able to find a recording of it. So it's the marvel of hearing the bird, but also knowing that within the birds themselves, they each have their own personality is really kind of an inspiring thing in and of itself. So,
Robert, anything you would add to what you
shared
just earlier?
Two remarks you already heard from me, but I would say that to share with you that I live 1,000 feet above the valley floor in Eugene, Oregon. I also live in Portland. mostly on the weekends. But when I'm in Eugene, I'm 1,000 feet above the valley floor, and the wealth of bird life and wildlife is quite incredible. So the bird sounds are always with me. I hear them, continually because of being in a place where there's not much mechanical noise. I'm at the top of a mountain, essentially. So fewer and fewer cars as you go up to the top. And that's really wonderful to have the mechanical noise that, quite frankly, plagues us nowadays. I'm sure you would agree, and maybe, hopefully, replaced by these incredible natural sounds that are so much part of who we are. The last thing I want to say is that everything you heard in my piece was a literal transcription of birdsong, the 12 songs. So there is nothing that I wrote myself as my own material. It's me and the birds because I transcribed it. But I discovered from those 12 bird songs that birds in Oregon sing in the key of C.
In the last couple minutes that we have remaining, any questions from the audience, either here in Portland or online?
Has this experience of composing the music changed how you listen to the birds now?
Definitely. I studied a little bit in school. The composer Messiaen, of course, transcribed bird songs and used those in his music as well. And so I thought about it a little bit from that angle. Academically, and then I have to say I might be one of those people, like a lot of us, who imagine themselves really appreciating nature and wildlife, but taking birdsong maybe even for granted. I had the experience of writing this piece, and then I had some friends in from out of town. I just moved out to Beaverton, and they'd never seen my place before, and they were standing in the backyard, and I was saying, "Oh, it's so nice how quiet this neighborhood, yada yada blah blah." And my friend's fiance said, "Oh, it's so nice though that you've got all these birds singing," and it's the kind of thing that I thought I need to stop and listen to this every once in a while. It's so important. I love what Robert said. They're a part of us, and this experience definitely changed the way I thought about it. It's not just the act of saying, "Oh, that's kind of cute, I'll transcribe that." There are these elements, for instance, in my bird where there are elements that are common to most of the birds of the species, but then there are these hundreds of unique calls within that. It's really cool.
Any others? Yes.
So I have a question submitted via Facebook. So this question was already touched on a little bit by Robert, but how much did you have to change the bird song that inspired you to fit it into your music?
Okay. So maybe David or Matthew. Robert kind of touched on this already.
I took it down an octave.
Or two.
I mean, I can say that I think what I can hear from my colleagues' pieces is that we've all tried to kind of represent the bird as accurately as we can because the birds themselves are composers. They have their own vocabulary, and we're just trying to, take that vocabulary and make it into something meaningful for us. So it really doesn't take much between the bird and the human if you're paying attention.
Can I encourage everybody to check out the Cornell Laboratory website? The bird sound, the bird song and call samples there are really tremendous, and there's a plethora of them, and they're fascinating to listen to. So
yeah, and let me encourage all of us who are here at the World Forestry Center to check out our partners' tables in the lobby. I want to thank all of you for joining us. My last request is to all of you in showing our thanks to the musicians and the composers here today. There's the inspiration right there. This ends our program and live stream. Thank you for joining us.